Pollination. Define pollination. Explain the difference between the two types of pollination, cross and self-pollination. Devise a table of the features of wind-pollinated and insect-pollinated flowers, and predict what would happen if all the bees died out. So just to go over the parts of the flower, the bits that we'll need to know for pollination are the stigma, which is the female part of the flower. You've got the stigma, the style, and then the ovary, which contains the ovules. And then the male part of the flower, which is the stamen. You've got the anther, which is where the pollen is found. And then the stamen is the stick that holds the anther. So pollination is where the male gamete must be transferred to the female carpel if a new individual is to be made. And the transfer of pollen from the anthers of the stamen to the stigma of the carpel is called pollination. The transfer of pollen from the anthers to the stigma is called pollination. So pollen may be transferred within the same flower, which is where it self-pollinates, or pollen can be transferred to a different flower, which is called cross-pollination. With cross-pollination, there will be a variety between the offspring and a greater chance of survival. So cross-pollination is actually slightly better for survival and variation. Pollen may be transferred between flowers by the wind or by insects. So with insect pollination, the bee will visit the flower with the right stamen, and then the bee will visit a flower with the right stigma, and it will transfer the pollen. With wind pollination, the pollen is blown by the wind from the anthers and caught by the stigmas. So you tend to find that wind-pollinated flowers have a feathery stigma. They have long filaments with the anther which hang outside of the flower to catch any pollen, so that the wind can catch the pollen and carry it along. So adaptations for insect pollination. So how are flowers adapted for pollination by insects such as bees and butterflies? So first of all, they might have nectar, which is a source of food for the insects. They'll have colourful scented petals to attract the insects. They have large sticky pollen grains which become attached to the insect's body. And the stiff anthers and stigmas are positioned where insects must brush past them. So adaptations for wind pollination. How are flowers adapted for pollination by the wind? So they have small, dull-coloured petals because they don't need to attract anything. They have huge numbers of light, tiny pollen grains. They have long, feathery stigma hanging outside of the flower so the pollen can be trapped. And the anthers hang loosely outside of the flower so wind can blow pollen. So in summary, pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Pollen may be transferred within the same flower, which is called self-pollination, or it may be transferred to a different flower, which is called cross-pollination, which creates more variety. Insect-pollinated flowers have brightly coloured petals, scent and nectar. And wind-pollinated flowers are dull, have long feathery stigma and anthers which hang outside of the flower.